So, why are we here again? We're here to follow MEPC 82. This is a regular occurrence, and there's a lot of familiar faces I can see from the registration list. So that's good. We're here to talk about the progress that's made. Perhaps not as much as we'd hoped, but we'll discuss that as we go through the PowerPoint presentation, as we go through the presentation. And we'll talk about the various areas. We've tried to cut into the relevant areas, and the presentation will be hosted by myself, Mark Smith, then it will shift to Edwin Pang, and then Sarah Maccan. And I'll allow the other speakers to introduce themselves because I feel that's the best way to describe their background and exactly what they're going to do during the webinar. So, first of all, and I'm sorry for those of you that are very familiar with this, but we're very quickly going to canter through. What is the difference between tank to wake and well to wake? Tank to wake is this part of the process from the fuel tank on board the vessel until the ship is propelled through the water and creates wake. If we're looking at well to wake, we're looking at the whole other part of the process. And if you had some sort of a problem with this tractor, if it was a clapped out tractor here, then it's not going to have a positive influence on zero or low carbon fuels, and it's going to add to the carbon mix. Also, when we look at things like wind, electric, wave power, then that is truly zero carbon. So why are we talking about this? There's been further development and progress towards the GESAMP, which is the group of experts on the scientific aspects of marine environmental pollution. After the adoption of the 2024 guidelines on the life cycle GHG intensity marine fuels, Resolution MEPC 391 established this working group, and interested member states and international organizations were invited to prepare proposals for default emission factors in order to allow this GSAMP working group to review them after MEPC 83. So that's going to be just over the horizon, March or April next year, I believe. So we'll see more from the outcome from that. The next thing we want to look at here is the short-term reduction measures and what really has been announced at MEPC 82. So the committee developed a way forward for the review of the short-term greenhouse gas reduction measures, GHG. Priority is to achieve 40% reduction in CO2 emissions per transport work by 2030 compared to 2008. Now, it's important to remember that this is slightly different to some of the other targets you see because this includes the transport work. So therefore, it's allowing for the transport cargo work on board the vessel, how much cargo is carried on board the vessel. And also, some people get confused between CO2 emissions and GHG emissions, but CO2 accounts for about 76% of total greenhouse gas emissions. Another point we're going to go on to next is some of the short-term reduction measures, but I just really want to highlight something that Edwin's going to talk about in his slides, and that's the STCW approach to bringing engineers and crew on board vessels into this part of the mix, in this part of the understanding. Some of the vessels we visited in the recent period don't seem to have as much of a grasp on some of this information as we'd have hoped. And that's somewhere as a club we're hoping to move forward with. And we'd be great and like to work with Edwin. So if any of you in the audience obviously have an interest in this and also STCW training standards for alternative fuels, then please get in touch because it's something we'd like to progress at an excellent next stage. So looking next, we're now looking onto the short-term GHG reduction measure review. And Edwin's going to elaborate on this in more detail, but as we sometimes do in some of these webinars, I'm going to very briefly introduce the concept, talk about it loosely, and then Edwin's going to dive down into more detail. So the phase one, as you can clearly see, is before the 1st of January 2026. Phase two is after the 1st of January 2026. And we can see on the left here, we've got CII as an operational energy efficiency performance indicator. How robust is it? And that's the question that's been asked and on a lot of people's lips. And it's definitely a question that's very relevant. Phase 1 and 2, we're looking at impact of idle and port waiting time. Obviously, the analogy I always use for those that are not familiar is the fuel consumption of a car. You know, when you're in port or idling, you're not moving any distance, but you're consuming fuel. So this needs to be taken into consideration. And then we've got a list on the right-hand side where I'll circle here, and I don't need to list all of these out, but it's looking at the various elements, you know, ro-ro, cargo, different types of ships, and how the machinery will impact this. And Edwin's going to go into more detail on that, but I'm just introducing the concept at the moment. So we can also see cruise and passenger ships, time and port as features, and then we've got LNG carriers in the CII reference line. We've also got shorter voyages, and we've also took some focus on the impact of CII on ballast voyages. And then another important point which needs to be taken into consideration is just-in-time shipping and port call efficiency not incentivized by CII. It's important to note that there's a potential overlap with a basket of midterm measures and the accessibility of CII ratings and IMO DCS, which is something that I'm hoping Edwin can elaborate on a bit further. And then another important point here is the CII does not address fuel emissions on their fuel full life cycle. And then CII does not allow for pooling, which is something we'll develop on throughout this presentation. So with that, we just want to talk about something else that's a positive step, whether it's from an IMO perspective. You know, we've seen a lot of owners recently who are shifting to biofuels, whether it's on a global basis or whether it's because of their focus with Fuel Maritime or various other drivers. Then MARPOL Annex 6, Regulation 18.1 is introduced a tab in the GIS SIS module to include biofuel availability in ports. This was nominated by several delegations, supporting the need for accurate and up-to-date information on biofuel availability. The next thing we just want to bring to the attention here is sustainable certification. The interim process will be required, and the group considered recommendations regarding the development of a sustainable fuels certification framework, including draft guidelines. Interested parties were invited to submit concrete proposals to a future session on how reference certification schemes and the fuel life cycle label, FLL, in the draft legal text of the IMO Net Zero framework and associated guidelines. Now, it's just important, we really want to bring to your attention here that we've had a few members who are struggling with the certification, sustainable certification, particularly members who are purchasing fuel in the Netherlands, because we believe that the Dutch government are keeping the sustainable certification to prove themselves, and that's then proving difficult for owners and our members to then therefore pass on their proof of sustainability. So it's definitely a hot topic and definitely one to keep a focus on as we head through this next period. The next thing really we want to discuss is the changes to the DCS reporting and ship energy efficiency management plan. So it's aggregated annual information to be submitted to the IMO DCS, distinct from what ship owners submit to their RO and flag, and requires an update of the SAMP to be submitted and improved. And we show you the timings here in this next sheet. Edwin's going to go into that in a little bit more detail, but it's just important to notice that if you're preparing everything for this submission, then it's important to notice everything on the right-hand side here and also take into account the energy efficiency performance indicator. But I'm going to allow Edwin to go into more detail on that. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Edwin now and say thank you and look forward to hearing from your part, Edwin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Let me just take control for a second. And I'm actually here at the IMO again, having spent already 2 weeks here. Just to say, on the reporting side of things, you will have noticed that the new reporting scheme to DCS starts on the 1st of August 2025. However, early implementation could start on the 1st of January 2025. Now, all of you know that the DCS reporting is annual. And so if you would like, one of the things we are really keen to do is for as many ship owners to report from the 1st of January 2025. So we have the data to feed into the CII review and to build new baselines if we need to change the metric or have new correction factors. So although some of you may not be ready because the new reporting scheme almost requires flow meters to be installed, but if you already have them, then if you can, please try and report from the 1st of January 2025, the full granularity. Right. Now, just sort of moving on, Mark talked about this short-term GHG production measure review. It's really a CII review, and the table you see is up here. There were probably about 40 papers in total that were sent to MEPC 82, plus lots of papers from before. And we've had to categorize all of these papers into a bunch of challenges and gaps. So there are about 21, I think, challenges and gaps that we've categorized all these papers into. And then we've had to prioritize them. So we've prioritized those that we think could be sort of resolved or addressed within phase 1. That's before the 1st of January 2026. And a word about IMO timescales. Although 1st of January 2026 seems like a long time away, the IMO doesn't meet that often next year. So actually the time is quite limited in terms of what can be done before 1st of January 2026. So you might be a little bit underwhelmed by what's in the phase 1 box. And what's really in the phase 1 box are we need to add some reduction rates for the years 27 to 2030. So we should have those reduction rates agreed by sort of March, April next year. And then that first box is a bit cryptic. And all this is that we're looking at one way to improve or enhance the CII is to work and address the SEM, the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan, because quite a lot of stuff that is used to regulate CII comes from the SEM. And the idea is to have both some flexibility in the SEM to deal with all the problems many of you are having with CII, and also to have some form of strengthened audit capacity. So audits are mentioned in the SEM today, but they're not very clear as to how they sort of work. And then phase 1, phase 2 are some of the bigger ones. So particularly the impact of idle and port waiting time. We don't think we can solve this before the 1st of January 2026. So we started in phase 1 and it continues into phase 2. And then the phase 2 things are things we're going to look at after the 1st of January 2026. Now, just to say, just because there are items in here, it doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to be able to solve them, or we're going to even be able to agree that this is the way forward. So I just want to manage expectations. There's very, very limited time in what we have to do, and the solutions are quite complex. So we're looking at it. The IMO is looking at it, but yeah, progress might be slow, and don't expect huge changes, at least for the moment. We will need to find a way, because there's so much to address. We'll need to find a way to address common issues as much as possible, because we can't deal with every single little problem. But yeah, we'll probably need to try and merge some of these together. Mark mentioned accessibility. What accessibility is about is today, when you submit your data to your RO or to your administration, they do some verification and then they send that information to the IMO. But as a ship owner, you don't actually know what has been sent by the class society, by the RO or the administration to DCS. So you actually can't see what's in DCS. And there have been lots of instances where data that the ship owners has submitted has somehow gone slightly wrong, or the RO or the administration has submitted the wrong data into IMO. These are just typographical errors and so on. And so there are a number of discussions about accessibility. One is for ship owners to be able to see their data, but the other is for some of this fuel consumption information to be made more public. And then you get sort of very different reactions from the ship owning community. Some are quite happy for this information to be made public and no longer anonymized, and others are absolutely horrified by this idea. And the countries are fairly split. So the idea of accessibility is really to actually allow all this data that we collect in the DCS to be analyzed by anyone, rather than a very select few as it is today. And we think in some cases this is actually hindering solutions for CII. So there's a there's a whole mix here of how do you balance commercial confidentiality and the necessary analysis that you need to kind of fix the CII metric. I think that's probably it for this for now. I'm not going to elaborate more on it. Right. Yeah, this is broadly what I've spoken about. Now, then we have a few other items. So it's not just about CII that we talked about last week, and actually the last 2 weeks. What has been reported is there's been a mismatch in the fuel type percentage reported to DCS and for sulfur monitoring purposes. So you have two databases of fuel consumption information. The sulfur monitoring contains about 2/3 of the fuel that has been reported to DCS. And there what seems to be quite serious consistency issues for reporting VLSFO and USFO. And these are sometimes reported as HFO, sometimes reported as LFO. And the amount of, I can't remember which at the moment, but the amount of one of these fuels is much higher in the sulfur monitoring database as compared to DCS. So there needs to be some sort of adjustment or clarification as to what you should actually report fuels as to DCS. But no, this isn't really just an IMO DCS problem. This is also extending to fuel EU, because fuel EU doesn't actually have any of these categories, VLSFO, ULSFO. It sticks to the HFO, LFO, MGO. It's really a very old version of the ISO 8217 standard that's being referenced. And somehow we need to find a way to kind of match all of these things up. Mark mentioned very quickly this information on biofuel. Sometimes we sort of discuss these things and it sounds like it promises quite a lot, but actually what's being changed is something very minor. So the IMO has this IT system called GSIS, and there's an information module on the availability of sulfur compliant fuel. And this is now extended to cover biofuel that meet the requirements of MEPC.1 Circular 905, but without any further details. So all you get if you log into GSIS is that you'll be able to look at different ports around the world, and they will indicate, well, it's voluntary from the port, so I don't know how accurate it's going to be, but they will indicate whether or not biofuel is available for bunkering at that port. Proposals to reduce the administrative burden of unlimiting shaft power for EXI. So when you need to take the limiter off the shaft pulley system, these weren't taken forward, unfortunately. There was quite a lot of discussion. They've been, I think the regulators have been quite worried about people using the override a little bit too frequently. And so this reduction in the reporting burden that was being proposed just to streamline the operations at sea, there was this sort of balance that we didn't quite manage to make happen. So this hasn't been taken forward, unfortunately. What we do know is that for 2023, there were only about 80 vessels that used that at least reported use of their override for a total of just over 200 instances where the override was used. So it's not a huge number of people who are actually using the override. So that's quite good. As Mark says, this week we are discussing the gaps in the STCW code. And as we know, we have put in a submission suggesting that energy efficiency needs to be added as a competence to the STCW code. A few other things not on the slide. Mark mentioned sustainable certification. Together with the Maritime Miller Center and Brazil, we're leading this work into writing some guidelines for recognition of certification schemes. So what this means is that today, when you buy a marine fuel, the only sort of sustainable certification that you might be able to find is according to the EU REDS RED scheme. When we have a midterm measure that encompasses fuels from all over the world, we cannot be expecting that the only sustainability certification that applies is the EU RED, because the IMO has its own criteria now, has its own LCA guidelines. And so what this work is going to set up between now and 83 is to write some guidelines as to what requirements we expect of national certification schemes around the world, how we recognize them, how we accept them, and so that when we get to implementation of the midterm measure, the global fuel standard in 2027 or 2028, you'll be able to buy fuel that is certified to an IMO scheme in a way that you can't today. So work is ongoing. We will have some draft guidelines by MEPC 83. And if any of you have any observations you'd like to sort of participate or help out, then please get in touch. I think that's about it. I need to say, yes, of course, the issue with the Dutch system on biofuels, I think there's some discussion on this instead of just the proof of sustainability, but the POC as well. So that some work on that is also ongoing. I think that's all I have to say for the moment. And I'll hand to Sarah.
Thank you, Edwin. Mark, were you going to speak on these slides before I move on?
No, it's okay. I think we've covered it really, and I don't think there's anything else to add, Sarah. So I think if you just carry on with your part, that'd be great, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so just to introduce myself, my name's Sarah Maccan, and I'm a senior solicitor at North Standard, handling FD&D claims in Nordics and Northern Europe, and also the Mediterranean. So I'm going to move on now to consider the outcomes of MEPC 82 in respect of the contractual context. I'm going to touch very briefly on the energy efficiency of vessels, which has already been talked around, and then I'm going to move on to consider the development of the basket of candidate midterm measures. So in respect of the energy efficiency of ships, it's already been mentioned that there was this review at MEPC 82 of the short-term greenhouse gas measures, namely CII and EEXI. So just to recap, EEXI is the Energy Efficiency Existing Ship Index and CII is the Carbon Intensity Indicator. So the CII determines the annual reduction factor needed in order to ensure continuous improvement of a vessel's operational carbon intensity within a specific rating level. And Mark and Edwin have already spoken about the challenges and the gaps in the short-term greenhouse gas measures, which have been identified by MEPC. So I'm not going to say too much on that. However, in respect of CII, I just wanted to mention that the gaps and challenges identified includes an acknowledgement that the current CII enforcement mechanism does not provide sufficient incentive for changes in operational behaviour. Another area identified for consideration is that CII does not allow for pooling or for fleet averaging. Also, the CII reduction factor has not yet been identified for the years 2027 to 2030. So as Mark and Edwin explained, MEPC have agreed that the identified gaps and challenges will be addressed in two phases. The first before the 1st of January 26, and then the second will extend beyond the 1st of January 2026. So in respect of the current CII enforcement mechanism not providing sufficient incentive for changes in operational behaviour, that's been identified for phase 1, whereas pooling has been identified for stage 2. In terms of next steps, the MEPC has established a correspondence group that will be reporting to MEPC 83 in April 2025, and the correspondence group will consider the possible options to address the gaps and challenges and develop draft amendments to existing instructions or develop new instruments. In addition, an intersessional meeting of the Working Group on Air Pollution and Energy Efficiency will be held, and it's thought that this will be at the end of March 2025. So in terms of the contractual implications in respect of CII, at this stage, it's very much having to wait and see the outcomes of the phase 1 and the phase 2 reviews, and also waiting to hear what comes out of MEPC 83 in April next year. So I'm now going to move on to consider what progress was made at MEPC 82 in respect of the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from vessels and the development of the basket of candidate midterm measures. So MEPC 82 was preceded by the 17th session of the Intersessional Working Group on Reduction of Greenhouse Gas Emissions from Ships, and that was held the week before MEPC 82. And during that week, the Intersessional Working Group considered the basket of candidate midterm measures, which has been reframed as the IMO Net Zero Framework, and that's for agreement at MEPC 83 in April next year. The framework sets out a new MARPL Annex 6, Chapter 5, called the Regulations on the IMO Net Zero Framework, and that's going to include subchapters on a goal-based marine fuel standard regulating the phased reduction of the marine fuel's greenhouse gas intensity, and also economic mechanisms to incentivize the transition to net zero. The economic mechanism may be linked directly to the greenhouse gas intensity mechanism or be a standalone mechanism. So the International Working Group considered 5 specific proposals which have been put forward, and I'll touch now on 2 of those proposals. One proposal, which was submitted by the European Union members, Japan and the European Commission, is the greenhouse gas fuel standard combined with an economic measure. This proposal sets out a trajectory for greenhouse gas fuel intensity reduction per year on a well-to-wake basis, and that would be from 2027 through to 2050, taking into account the LCA guidelines. 2 sets of reduction values were proposed. One was to follow the 2023 IMO strategy base reduction levels of ambition, and the other to follow the striving for levels of ambition. The greenhouse gas fuel standard proposal would allow for flexible compliance. It would allow for the ability to bank over compliance, and it would also allow for pooling and the ability to purchase remedial credits. In respect of the economic measure put forward, it was proposed that vessels would pay $100 per ton of CO2 equivalent. And the proposal also includes a reward for vessels using fuel with a very low greenhouse gas intensity. One of the other proposals put forward is the green balance mechanism, and this was submitted by the World Shipping Council. This proposal relies on a fuel standard having been agreed with incremental reductions in greenhouse gas fuel intensity on an annual basis from 2027 through to 2050. And again, that will be on a well-to-wake basis, taking account of the LCA guidelines. In respect of the economic measure for that proposal, it would very much depend upon the attained greenhouse gas fuel intensity of a ship compared to the fossil fuel equivalent reference greenhouse gas fuel intensity. So that would then determine whether a fee is payable or whether there would be a financial reward. So the concept is very much for early movers to be rewarded and the fees of others to balance those rewards. And there will be a 2-tier reward system put in place. The green balance mechanism proposal also includes the ability to pool together with other ships to calculate an attained greenhouse gas fuel intensity. And it's understood that if a pooled attained greenhouse gas fuel intensity were eligible for reward, then all vessels in that pool would receive a proportion of the reward and proportionate to the energy they used, irrespective of the individual vessel's greenhouse gas fuel intensity, which on its own may have not been eligible for a reward. So where are things now following MEPC 82? So at MEPC 82 last week, there was a broad agreement to an architecture for a fuel standard, but further discussion is required to agree how a ship or collection of ships must meet that standard. For example, whether there will be flexible compliance through pooling or compliance and ability to pay for compliance units, etc., and what would be the exact trajectory for reducing the greenhouse gas fuel intensity. There's also further need to discuss the design of the economic measure further. MEPC agreed to a working draft set of the MARPL Annex 6 amendments using the IMO Net Zero framework, but it's very much a working draft document at this stage, which will be further developed in the lead up to MEPC 83 in April next year, where the regulatory text is to be approved. Consensus was reached at MEPC 82 regarding the application of the framework and that it will be to ships of 5,000 GT, with the potential to increase this scope to ships of 400 GT and over at a date to be determined. So the further development of the legal text in the IMO Net Zero framework will be progressed at a meeting of the Intersessional Working Group, and that will take place in February 2025, and then it's set to be finalised at MEPC 83. The proposals are then set to be adopted at an extraordinary MEPC in autumn 2025, so this time next year, and then due to enter into force in 2027. So as 2027 is not too far away, there's a need to start thinking about the longer term charter parties and considering possible contractual implications of the proposed basket of candidate midterm measures. So I'd like to now touch upon in the next couple of slides the possible contractual considerations. So firstly, I'm going to look at the economic mechanism. So if the intention is that compliance will sit with the vessel within the MARPOL regulations, then the chances are that ship owners will want to pass the cost of compliance, or at least some of that cost, down to charterers. And how such risk or cost is addressed in a charter party will, of course, very much depend on the type of charter party you're dealing with and also the commercial negotiations between the parties. However, there are some points that are worthwhile considering. As mentioned, as this will be a MARPOL requirement, it will apply to the ship, and so ultimate compliance is at the ship or the owner level. So who is ultimately responsible for the cost of the contribution for the emissions will therefore need to be set out contractually. In addition, if there's to be a reward mechanism, then consideration will need to be had as to how this should be distributed and to whom. And that would need to be dealt with in the context of the contract. For example, if it were to be given to owners, but then would that be passed on to the relevant charterers? So, and also how the compliance of such an economic measure will be enforced would need to be dealt with contractually. Obviously, it remains to be seen how that would be done, but it would need to be thinking about how to put that within the contractual context. So likewise, just moving on now to the technical measure, the global fuel standard. Again, it will be important to address this in your charter parties, particularly where the ultimate compliance is not with the entity providing the fuel, which is usually the time charterer. So where there's a requirement to stem fuel of a particular greenhouse gas intensity, then an owner will no doubt want their charterers to comply with that when providing fuel to the vessel. So provision will therefore need to be included within the relevant charter party in respect of fuel specification, fuel testing, and liability. Also, provision would need to be included in respect of providing to the party responsible for compliance the requisite documentation and certification. Consideration would also be needed in the charter party context in respect of issues such as possible penalties, also if there's any pooling or other flexible compliance mechanisms. Hopefully, after MEPC 83 in the spring, we will have further clarity on the specifics. In the meantime, however, as mentioned, if you're entering into charter parties that may span into 2027, prior to the regulations being clarified and adopted, then we would recommend trying to include some wording in charter parties in order to address the points that I've just mentioned there. So that brings me to the end of what I was going to say. So I'll hand over to Mark, who I think is going to take us into questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, Edwin. Excellent presentations. We've got a question from the audience, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take control and then I'm going to go to this slide here. Hopefully everybody can see the short-term GHG reduction measure review on their screen. And that will help us to answer the question here. So the question, and just for the rest of the audience, is the shipping industry do need additional corrective factors CII, short-term stay in port, waiting time. We understand corrective factors expected within 2025. Please confirm. Now, according to the latest information from MEPC 82, that brings us to this table here, and you'll see that this falls in, the impact of idle and port waiting time falls within phase 1 and 2. So Edwin, perhaps you could elaborate on the timings of that. And I know you mentioned before about the start of 2025. What sort of time frame are we looking at exactly here? Obviously, we've got a rough idea, but how do you think it's going to progress in the near term?
Thanks, Mark. The earliest we would see any correction factors being introduced is going to be after 1st January 2026. It's just a matter of, as you see in phase 1, we've got only some the first box is about the SEM and the second box is about the Z factor. These are the things that we think we can actually do before the 1st of January 2026. Now, if we were to make any changes to any new correction factors, we wouldn't actually have the time to do it at MEPC 83. And as Sarah just mentioned, there is the second MEPC that we have in next year is actually a special session. So there's no working groups at that special session. So you can't do anything to have on CII in that special session. So the earliest you can actually start looking at amending guidelines to have a new correction factor is after the 1st of January 2026. However, usually although we didn't do this in the very big, when we first had correction factors, but when we do correction factors, we do actually need to do a number of things. We actually need to collect data to revise the reference lines that then now have the correction factors taken into account. And when we also have to, we really do need to have the data to also recalculate the rating boundaries, and then you will need to redo your SEM. Now, if you follow that entire process through properly, and this is also why I said if you're able to submit data from the 1st of January 2025 according to the new DCS requirement, then please do so, because this is what we need to build new baselines, new reference lines. But if you follow that entire process, the earliest any revised CII with a correction factor could enter into force might be in 2028 or 2029. So this is why I said at the very beginning, don't necessarily look to this review for short-term fixes. It's going to be quite long-term. There is some recognition that if you are in E and you continue to be in E, there is not going to be a situation where someone's going to pull your certification or your permit to operate. So it is still soft enforcement. If after a year of E, you still have another E, you do a plan of corrective actions. They will probably start to expect some kind of improvement, but it's not going to be anything concrete or anything hard like we have in, say, port state control, where you can be detained, or nothing like that is on the table. So we need to take those two things together. So everyone's aware the CII needs to be fixed. There are lots of problems, but the fix is going to take quite some time.
Thank you. That's excellent, Edwin. I'm going to stop sharing this presentation. And basically, we've just received a question in the Q&A there on the GHG intensity. Now, I believe there's some differences. I'm going to actually use another presentation that I have in the background to hopefully to help display on this. We're slightly deviation off topic here, but I just thought a picture paints 1,000 words, so it may help to show you some of the other slides we have here. So this is the targeted reduction, I believe, for the fuel-EU maritime. And if I'm understanding the question correctly, this obviously differs from the GHG reduction targets, which is the IMO level. So there are some differences there between the two, and that is basically the difference in the GHG intensity reduction, if I've understood that question correctly. Hopefully.
Can I come in, Mark?
Yes.
Yeah. So I read it a little bit differently, but so the IMO has this GHG fuel standard, which is the international equivalent to fuel EU, and it started off as being very similar to Fuel EU, but through the negotiation process we have at the IMO, it's becoming more and more distinct, let's say, from Fuel EU. However, there are these reduction rates that are they kind of are somewhat like the Fuel EU, but they go faster earlier. So it's a much steeper trajectory. This is not very good news for those on this call, but the trajectory looks like it is a lot steeper than what Fuel EU. And the other difference that we may end up with is that instead of having targets change every 5 years, the target may change every year or every 2 years, because this 5-year plateau of a reduction rate means that you don't have to do anything in that 5 years. You start at the fuel intensity in the first year of that block, and you keep going. Now, the idea at the IMO is that actually the trajectory keeps declining rather than having these sawtooth things going down. It just keeps declining, and to kind of push everyone to keep doing better each year. So, and then the second part of the question from George is as you're aware, Article 30 of the Fuel EU regulation has a review clause in there that covers a lot of different sorts of reviews. But one of them is if the IMO comes up with a global fuel standard in 2027, then this review will look at trying to figure out what sort of alignment there can be between Fuel EU and the global fuel standard. And in that sort of language is the possibility that if it is doing what it's supposed to do, potentially, then Fuel EU could be repealed. But that's a long way into the future. At the very least, you'll get some alignment. Whether it'll be repealed, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. And then there's 2 questions I'd like to pose to yourself, Sarah, on the Bimco Charter Party clauses, please. If you could answer Renee and Gaetano D'Alessio on those, please.
Of course, yeah. So I'll take Renee's question first in respect of whether Bimco are coming with any clauses in respect of the kind of IMO net zero framework. As yet, I'm not aware of a drafting committee having been put together by Bimco to consider that. I think obviously at this stage it's very much a work in progress in terms of MARPOL Annex 6 and the new chapter 5. So I think we'll very much have to wait to see on the regulatory text, and then it might be after that time that we'll see Preston clauses being put together. In the meantime, as I say, I think it is very much still worth considering for those longer term time charter parties, which will be spanning into 2027, some wording, just kind of recognizing that there are these regulatory changes that will be coming, and kind of trying to apportion liability, appreciating that at this stage we don't yet know exactly what it's going to look like, but just putting something in there, and even along the lines of an agreement to agree. I appreciate that obviously you want something more concrete ideally, but at this stage, until certainly MEPC 83 in the spring, when we will hopefully know a bit more, it's kind of just making sure, kind of thinking ahead and just trying to think about how to deal with that in the contractual context and the apportionment of that liability. And as mentioned, then just the second question in respect of kind of Fuel EU, and again on Bimco, and whether there's going to be a time charter clause for Fuel EU. There is a drafting committee that is put together a draft which is up for consideration, but as yet don't have a date when that's going to be published. But I think the intention was certainly for the back end of this year. So hopefully we'll be able to say more on that soon. I'm just having a look at the next question which came in. So since under the time charter, fuel is supplied by the charterers and operational control is with the charterers, while technical due diligence remains with the owners, what actions immunity do the owners have in case the charterers are not operating the vessel with CII speed threshold to improve CII rating of the vessel? I don't know if you want to jump in on that one, Mark, on the technical side, and then I'll kind of make comments on the contractual.
Yeah, I mean, It would, from the contractual side, you would need to obviously ensure that the speed is complied with from a speed and performance perspective, but also CII, and that I think is what the question's getting at. So if the charters are not operating the vessel with a CII speed threshold to improve the CII vessel, then surely there should be a contractual carve out in there to protect them from that. Is that correct, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I think it very much come down to what has been agreed within
Agreed in
the
the
charter
contractual.
party, and
Yeah.
and so on the contractual side, yes, it will very much depend on what is within the clause, if there is one, and the kind of what was agreed on that. Obviously, we've got the Bimco CII clause, but we're tending to see that clause isn't being incorporated into charter parties as drafted, so it will very much depend on what has been agreed between the parties in respect of that position.
And communication's the key here, and planning as well, isn't it, between the two parties? It's something we've seen both sides of the story from our perspective, where we see owners and charters that are cooperating, and in some instances we see the opposite. So it is important to do that. Hopefully that's answered that question. The next question is with respect to Fuel EU, despite the fact that the deficit calculation is regulated, the potential surplus now, do you believe that Bimco will come with relevant clauses, or is it left to a free market agreement between the owners and the charterers? I think that one's for you, Sarah, for the Bimco side of it.
So just in respect of the I think the question there is just asking about the kind of where there's the deficit and calculating the penalty. Again, in respect of Fuel EU, I think Bimco, obviously they're drafting a clause on the time charter side. Maybe like EU ETS, we will see further clauses coming out, particularly for in the voyage charter context. With EU ETS, there's a whole suite of clauses that were published, and also a shipment clause. So I think we will see kind of further clauses coming out, which will come to that kind of that calculation. I think in terms of the kind of the allocation of where that cost, obviously compliance rests with the vessel, but in contractual context where that cost will lie in terms of whether charters will be responsible for penalty costs, and making sure that's very much put within the contractual context, because that's going to be very, very important, because under the regulations, obviously it will rest with the ISM company. I'm not sure exactly yet what other drafting committees Bimco are putting together, but I imagine that their attention may be turning, as I say, more to the voyage charter context once the time charter clause has been published.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any more questions from anybody else in the audience? I mean, if you don't have any questions yet, then some may jump to your mind, and please feel free to follow up. Where in the follow-up package, it'll have all of our email addresses, Edwin, Sarah, and myself. I'm just going to give it another 30 seconds just to make sure no other questions come in, and then I think we'll look to let everybody get on with their busy days. Okay, some interesting questions there. I think I'm just going to pose a question to both of you, Edwin and Sarah, just out of the blue here. Sarah, what do you see the biggest complication is over the next 2 years or 3 years from a decarbonisation perspective? And the same question to you, Edwin, really. What do you see the biggest challenges ahead?
I think for me, if I go first, I think obviously touched on the kind of the need to have everything set out very clearly within the contractual context, particularly with all these regulatory changes, and resting with ISM company or with the vessel, and therefore making sure that within the contractual context, any kind of risk, liability, allocation of cost is very clearly set out within those contracts within the charter party chain, in order that each party knows what responsibility it rests with them, particularly when it comes to kind of global fuel standard, and where it's going to be the charterers stemming the fuel, but obviously ultimate compliance rests with the owners, making sure, just like within Fuel EU, that all the requisite documentation is being passed to the owners, that's set out clearly within the charter party context, and also in terms of the allocation of any levy or penalty costs, or if there's any reward, how that's going to be apportioned between the parties. So there's a lot to think about there, and I think there's going to be, as highlighted in the questions, the need for clauses, precedent clauses, in order to kind of assist members and brokers with what would be suitable for charter parties. And it's something as a club we have been putting together as well. We do have clauses which we've been drafting, particularly for Fuel EU, with that coming up to, obviously from January next year will be applicable. So been assisting members with clauses, and we'll be continuing to develop further precedent clauses which we can share. And if obviously if members want us to have a look at any charter parties, review any clauses, or give our comments, I'm very happy to do so. And I'll hand over to Edwin.
Thanks, Sarah. I think there's probably two major challenges in these years going forward. One is actually trying to find enough low carbon fuel to go around to source it and to make sure it's not fraudulent. And so the whole issue of certification is actually quite important. Some of you may be aware of the kind of used cooking oil fraud that for some of the fuel that we're using. So that's kind of one area, trying to find fuel, good fuel in quantities that are sort of vaguely affordable. That's going to be a real challenge. The second, I think, major challenge is that we have this avalanche of regulations coming in at a very fast pace, and they're all somewhat complicated, and they interact, but they also then create additional complications in chartering, but also they create unregulated markets. So all the flexibility mechanisms that we see in Fuel EU and that we will see in GFS create these unregulated markets of trading some kind of benefit between companies. And this opens up a whole can of worms. It's very difficult to track where the benefit of the lower GHG fuel or lower GHG intensity fuel, where that benefit is going, because there's also issues with is the fuel for compliance, and then your cargo owner is claiming a benefit, and so on. So this is there's a lot kind of going on, and then you add book and claim schemes, and then if you start adding things like the carbon capture, this carbon accounting is going to be very, very challenging and very complicated.
Thank you very much, Edwin. That's excellent. We've just got one more question that's coming there, and that's about coastal going vessels. Now, obviously, there's developments afoot with respect to offshore vessels. So from the 1st of January 2025, offshore and general cargo vessels over 400 GT will be required to comply with EU MRV, and then from 2027 they'll be included in the EU ETS. But coastal vessels, I don't know if it's something you've heard more, but I suppose it's dictated by local jurisdiction to a certain extent when it doesn't fall within, because the latest IMO guidelines, I see that they're referring to 5,000 GT, and then vessels over 400 GT is going to be decided within due course. But I'd imagine coastal vessels will be dictated by local jurisdiction. But has there been any developments that you're aware of with that, Edwin? Because you'll probably know more than us in that area.
The IMO only recognizes either international or domestic, so coastal is not a category or a legal category that we have. So if your coastal vessel is registered to the country off the coast that you only trade in, and you'd never go into international waters, then you would very likely escape application of any of these new measures, as you would escape probably the CII. However, if you trade if you trade coastally between countries, then you automatically become an international vessel. Then all of them will apply as long as you're above the 5,000 GT limit. If you trade mostly within one country and are registered to that flag or to that country, but occasionally, and occasionally is something that's very loose, you need to go outside of that area and trade internationally. There are single voyage exemptions available. Whether your flag state will allow you to use that is a different question, because there have been instances where this provision has been refused. Yeah, it's not super clear, but just judging from your question, I'm hoping that helps.
So just to clarify on that then, Edwin, if it's local jurisdiction may impact coastal vessels, would it have an impact on coastal vessels that were basically, let's say, staying in the UK, for example, or other countries for that matter, because they may have a stricter decarbonisation target than other countries?
I haven't seen any yet. The local
okay.
ones have usually been more lax compared to the international regulations, as far as I can tell, apart from the regional EU one.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, okay. It's a little bit of an unknown at the moment by the sounds of it, and what will happen in the future. But as we see with all of this, it seems to develop on an annual basis, so we may know more this time next year, hopefully. Anyway, we'll see on that. So, okay, I think that's all of the questions now. We've answered all of the questions, unless there's anything in the Q&A that I've missed. Sorry, we've just got one. What are the likelihood of EU and EU ETS and IMO measures align? In my opinion, it's not very likely in the short term. I don't know what you'd like to say on that, Edwin and Sarah, but there's it's quite a different trajectory from both sides.
There will probably be no alignment between ETS and any economic measure that we have at the IMO, because the ETS is a sort of allowance trading system in effect with a cap. And the IMO is not doing that. The IMO will be a direct levy. And so I don't know whether there is a review clause in the ETS for maritime that allows it to take into account what's going on at the IMO in the same way that there is in the Fuel EU. That I'm not sure. But yeah, for the moment, it will be very divergent.
Thank you. And we've just had another question come in about bunker vessels, but I'd imagine it would be similar answer to what we give on the coastal vessels. I'm not aware of any specific exemptions per se.
Yeah, so there were some submissions this session from Intertanko about bunker vessels. I mean, generally, as I said, if your bunker vessel only operates within, I don't know, say Singapore, and you are registered with Singapore flag, then you will escape all of these measures because you are operating as a domestic vessel. The problem is that for some of the larger bunker vessels, you very occasionally need to go to someone else's waters or potentially international waters, and this is a gray area. So, and the Intertanko proposal is actually just to take bunker vessels out of CII altogether, and presumably for some of these other things. But yeah, it's very much about whether you're considered domestic or do you trade internationally. And if you are domestic, you must be registered to the flag of the country that you're trading domestically in.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you. I think that's all the questions answered. We're up on time now. We've managed to exactly fill 1 hour, which is good considering it wasn't many announcement of MEPC 82, but it just shows you the questions on the periphery of all these topics. And I really do thank you both and everybody else in the audience for their interesting questions and coming along to our webinars and creating this demand which goes on and on in this particular area. So I'd just like to say thank you. I'd also like to say thank you to the digital team for helping us prepare for these webinars and preparing all the material and making the slides look as they do. So with that, I just want to say thank you to everybody. Thanks again and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.